Standard is easy to learn but hard to master. Learn your matchups quick or you're courting disaster.
We got Lords for your hordes. Comment below as we walk through Week 4 of Foundation Standard. Well, folks, this week was a big one, with 15 major tournaments recorded spanning 120 top 8 slots. Of those, surprise, surprise, Dimir was at the top, notching 31 top 8s and 6 trophies. I mean, that's good enough for more than 25% of all top 8 spots and 40% of all trophies. We called that utter dominance, Max.
For sure. Hey, Mardu Reanimator came in second with 20 top 8s and 2 trophies of its own, putting up strong numbers despite the hate, just like Dimir.
Third place went to Jeskai Convoke, having a breakout week with 8 top 8s and 2 trophies, but most importantly, validating last week's State of the Meta projection. Love it when our predictions line up perfectly.
Absolutely. Rounding out Tier 1 is Golgari Demons with 11 top 8s, though not a single trophy. Can our heroes in green and black figure out a consistent path to some hardware this season? Or were the early trophies all they'll earn?
Kicking off Tier 2 is Boros Auras with only 5 top 8s, but 2 trophies nonetheless. Talk about that 40% conversion rating. Love that. It's quick, it's efficient, and a solid revamp on the list we had, I believe, in Brewer's Corner just a few weeks ago, Max.
Oh yes. Some questions answered for sure. Coming in 6th is Temur Otters with 7 top 8s, though not a single trophy. The issue with evaluating how strong this deck is stems from the complexity of piloting with it against it. Hard to say this early in the season why the deck is sticking around in Tier 2, but we'll have our answers by the time we hit Atlanta.
7th place goes to Azorius Cookies, boasting a perfect 2 top 8s and 2 trophies, meaning it took home the hardware 100% of the time it landed in the top 8, which is a weird and impressive statistic. Now, we talked about this deck some last week on our Brewer's Corner, and I'm stoked to see it showing up and taking down a couple trophies.
Last but not least, we've got Azorius Oculus, bringing up the final spot with 3 top 8s and a trophy of its own. This is an archetype that feels like it needs to evolve some more to compete, but man, is it close already. Plus, anyone who has snagged an Oculus onto the battlefield turn 2 can attest to how unfair this deck feels when you're not prepared.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll be showcasing Boros Discover and a Selesnya Aggro update.
And I'll be highlighting Esper Flayer and Mardu Reanimator. Now, let's kick things off with our Tier 1 breakdowns, starting with Dimir Aggro.
Well, when you've got 6 trophies, you have plenty of lists to poke through, but we're going to go ahead and use Mog's latest update, snagged from a 36-player MTGO Showcase qualifier, and let's take a look at what shifted. I mean, the big piece here, to me, is Preacher of the Schism gets shoved into the sideboard in this list, and I think that's really just saying we're not going to hedge the main so hard against red-based aggro. We're going to accept a lesser margin point on game 1 in exchange for a greater margin point against a lot of the rest of the format. Because Preacher is fantastic against red-based aggro, it's basically a guaranteed 2-for-1 in most instances, but you play that card against Domain, you play that card against a majority of the field that's trying to go bigger, mono-white control, etc., and it's bad. It's so slow. It just doesn't do what you need it to do there, so you end up siding them out constantly. And so I see where they went here. They said, no, Preacher's going to the side, Tidebinder to the main. Let's diversify the removal base. Let's go up to 4 Kaidos and really push that tempo. And let's get those Saiba Cryptomancers in, which is a spicy way to push forward with tempo.
Spicy is right. Now, I know the changes, but we do see aggro decks in Tier 1. Do you really think it's wise to hedge more against the other go bigger decks, or do you think this deck takes an even further evolution next week?
So I'll take this one from personal experience. I played in the Big Brain tournament, and I actually got to play against this exact list with my Dimir list, and I can tell you this list is much better against the mirror in game 1, and that was wildly apparent as I was trying to land a Preacher, and they're in the middle of just going, no, we're just doing Kaidos. Like, we're just going to go right through you. So if we expect a lot of mono-red aggro or red-based aggro in general, I like the list with Preacher, and I do expect to see a fair amount of that. But if your local meta is swamped with, like, let's say Domain, Tishana is where you want to be. So it's going to depend local meta and how big the tournament is. If it's global like the MTGO challenges are, I'd be tempted to push the Preacher back in the main. But we'll see. Time will tell on that one, honestly, because it's not an easy answer when it comes to how you build Dimir anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree there. And let's go ahead and start talking about those aggro decks in Tier 1, and we'll start with Mono Red Aggro.
J-Rod 115 smashed through a 91 player MTGO challenge this past Saturday with Mono Red, though to be fair, it isn't quite Mono Red anymore, is it? Now, this archetype is evolving to embrace a light green splash, and you see that with these Pop Hatch formations sitting in the sideboard now, as well as a couple of Questing Druids. And honestly, one of the bigger questions for me is, if we're playing Pop Hatch, do we need Twisted Fealty? Like, we have the ability to blow up those demons with regularity, so I'm not sure if this makes as much sense anymore unless you need 6 options to deal with demons, and maybe the matchup's that rough, but it's given up a lot. Let's also note that Lithomanic Barrage has been cut in the sideboard as Pop Hatch takes over there and says instant speed removal for Oculus is just fine. Beza is a problem, but it's not going to be the focal point of this. And I like where this is going, honestly. Like, the green splash is basically free. You know there's only 9 sources, but that's not really an issue if you're not trying to hit it until, let's say, later turns, turn 4, turn 5. There's going to be some consistency problems potentially, but time will tell. I like that they're trying it at least.
Okay. We've got a couple of aggro decks here in Tier 1. I want to ask, is red the best aggro deck for the moment? And really, how do you measure that? Is it just the fastest aggro for right now?
I mean, when you get to what's the best aggro deck, I think to a degree it depends on the rest of the meta, right? You're looking and saying, what is everybody else prepped for? Because any aggro deck these days, this isn't like the olden days where if you had the right aggro list, like you just ran through everybody forever, the whole season, like it's just busted. No, there's answers. So the best aggro deck to me is going to change week to week because people are going to be positioning their decks differently. And that's where you get this metagame puzzle, right? Like, if people really want to position against mono red, like they did last week, that's when we recommended Jeskai Convoke, because we said, okay, if they're not going to respect the swarm strategy, if they're all about single targeted removal, play the swarm strategy. That was the best aggro deck in my opinion last week. This weekend, hard to say. Now that Jeskai Convoke's out of the bag, everything shifts again.
Well done. Nuanced answer for a nuanced metagame. I totally agree. Let's talk about it, though. Let's talk about Jeskai Convoke.
Sir Hamilton 1 took me out of the semifinals of Sunday's Big Brain Tournament and then took down Domain in the finals, cementing a comeback week for this deck after it sat in the doghouse for a hot minute. And let's look at what changed here. Now, this list isn't too different from last week's. I think that really reflects how strong that initial list was and the fact that there isn't that many slots you want to shift, right? But Lithomantic Barrage, yet again, has been cut. And I want you to notice that trend as we go through these decks. Lithomantic Barrage is almost nowhere to be found. People are just cutting it left and right. In this case, for Split Up, which I like because this, to me, could be a mirror breaker, you know? Like, we get to a point very quickly in the mirror where we can just go, okay, blow up all your tapped creatures. All of my untapped creatures are still around. Now I'll tap them for Knight Errant. Now I'm way ahead. So I like that you have a 3-mana mirror-breaking Wrath, potentially. And I like that it could also help against some of the bigger Demons lists that are just trying to land, an Arcfiend. And you can play around that to a degree.
Okay. One thing noticeably absent is a lot of enchantment removal. We have seen that in the past few weeks. Should this deck run more enchantment hate in the sideboard? Destroy evil, exercise, those kinds of things.
So that's going to depend on whether we want the Disdainful Strokes. Protect the Negotiators and Disdainful Stroke are there along with Destroy Evil, and those 8 cards typically get boarded in together against a majority of the go big archetypes that either are demons or we're talking about mono white control or domain, anything with wrath effects. That's where you start to see the 6 counters to Destroy Evils, right? Do you want more Destroy Evil? It depends on how many wraths. If we don't see a lot of wraths, but we're seeing plenty of enchantments, you bump up Destroy Evils, you cut out the Disdainful Strokes. But otherwise, no, it's balanced as is if we're expecting a lot of Sunfalls, really.
And I do expect a lot of Sunfalls, especially after the cat being out of the bag from last week with Jeskai Convoke. So yeah, I like that response. All right, let's talk about the final list in our Tier 1 archetypes. Golgari Demons.
Young Prodigy made it to the semifinals of Friday's 82-player MTGO Challenge with Golgari Demons, and let's take a look at how they shifted some slots. Now, you'll note there isn't a single Arcfiend in here. We've given up on the Arcfiend plan. We've given up on most of the demons, and we're saying that Unholy Annex by itself is going to be strong enough to get us there. Now, you get to cheat a little and play 3 Soulstone Sanctuary, which is also a demon for those who are not fully thinking on this one. So you do have 7 demons in this list. The other thing that's worth noting is Shelly is that good. We're getting to the point where we're willing to take the damage, because if Unholy Annex pings us for 2 to draw a card and then we gain 2 when we draw a card, net 0, we're fine with that. Shelly is probably the stronger card of the 2 anyway. So in a weird way, Shelly's not counting as a demon, but it's acting as, close approximation, right? Now, I don't love the curve on this. There are 12 3-drops. It's a little heavy. And to me, it's also 1 swamp too few, because turn 1, I want cut down at a 90% success rate. This only has 13 untapped black sources for turn 1. That's a little low. That's a little low. But overall, the list looks strong.
Yeah, and it's a very nuanced point there, the line between running Shelly versus running Archfiend of the Dross, which leads me to my overall question. Are we really overthinking supporting Annex? What's wrong with running 4 Archfiends? What's wrong with running a couple of other demons? Do we run Annex at all? Red can make you pay for that life loss early in the game. So what do you think the overall strategy of this deck should be going forward?
So if I was going to play against mono red exclusively, I wouldn't put Annex in the main. I'd put it in the sideboard, because it is weak against mono red. But you're not trying to hedge too hard against one specific archetype, and Annex is a house against most of the format, because it just provides, with Llanowar Elves, a turn 2 draw engine that's comparable to Up the Beanstalk, if not better, with what you're trying to do. So do you need to have Archfiend? I don't like where Archfiend is right now. I don't love it in a format that has decks like Otters on the rise, where we're just bouncing 4-drops. I don't like it against the Mirror, where you have Glissa forcing you to block it. And I don't particularly love it against Dimir, where they're just finding ways around it and or tapping it down with Kaido for 2 turns and letting you die to it. So I don't love where Archfiend is represented. So I think this is a smart evolution to go into Shelly. Shelly is really hard for some of the other decks to deal with. Dimir has to get it off the board before Enduring Curiosity becomes a problem on drawing and losing 2 life per draw. Same with Otters. They have to deal with Shelly, or it's just going to start draining them as they keep going. So I like where Shelly's positioned right now in comparison, and I see why we went that way.
Yeah, notably Shelly's good against the Mirror as well, assuming that they're going to be running Annex as well with the Demon package. It's going to do really well in that Mirror matchup. So I can see where the strategy leans towards Shelly. Maybe we just need to clean up that 3-drop slot though, and decide, what we're going to put there. But other than that, I can see the deck's evolution panning out. Okay. All right. Well, that does it for our Tier 1 archetypes. Let's go ahead and jump down to Tier 2, where I will begin by talking about Boros Auras. All right, so Hamuda took down a 121-player MTGO challenge this past Monday with Boros Auras, solidifying the archetype's breakout week. Let's look at the list, though. I do note the 1 copy of Mabel, Heir to the Cragflame. This is coming back into use. This card was in there for a while, especially when this was more of a Boros Mice kind of archetype. I like this deck because of the way it can protect its creatures, right? We got a 3-2 split between Shard Mages to Sheltered by Ghosts in the main. Sheltered by Ghosts, house of card. I won't bring it up too much this time because we talked about it plentifully last week. But this is key removal and a little bit of protection. I love the card. 2-1 split of Nemesis to main versus the sideboard. Nemesis is still a house of a card as well, preventing life gain. There are still some life gain strategies out there trying to mitigate against aggro, and notably for a full set of Destroy Evil in the sideboard. This is obviously for the mirror matchup, but also for all the Overlord decks that we're starting to see, the go big strategies in mono white. Boros Auras, I like where it's placed. We'll have to see how it pans out with mono red and Jeskai Convoke still in the meta.
So, Max, when you look at Boros Auras and you look at mono red aggro, why Boros Auras instead of mono red?
So like I said, Sheltered by Ghosts, still a great card. You really have a clear sideboard plan against the graveyard-based decks, which are starting to come back. We're seeing those in Dimir colors, Rakdos colors, some reanimation here and there. But the enchantment removal as well. Having access to the enchantment removal is still key. really this choice is largely meta dependent. As we're seeing these shifts back and forth between different, off meta decks coming into the meta, you're going to have to make this decision based on your local and regional metas if you're playing those kinds of tournaments. You can protect your creatures from single target removal better with this deck, and that tends to be what mono red runs up against. When it comes to Dimir, when it comes to Golgari. So we'll see. It's largely meta dependent, but in a meta where you're still seeing a lot of single target removal, I think Boros Auras is a little bit better placed.
Yeah, those Shard Mages rescues put in a lot of work. I'm with you on that. But talking about decks that are on the rise, let's talk a little bit about Temur Otters.
Marco Mastarilli made it to the finals of Saturday's 57-player RCQ in Italy with Temur Otters. Let's look at the list last week. I'm noticing 2 copies of Negate in the sideboard over Disdainful Stroke. Now, I can kind of understand this choice. You have a little bit more flexibility with Negate to get rid of the early stuff. For example, if you're running into Annex, this can counter Annex, whereas Disdainful Stroke cannot. Low curve matchups, I can see where you would want that. So, that is a meta-dependent choice. I'm also noticing a spicy land in the deck, Tarnation Vista. Now, with the 3 copies of Roaring Furnace, if you're still keeping those in the deck, I can see where this would benefit you. You're tapping 2 lands for 3 colors, a little bit of ramp. And I also noticed a new card to the sideboard, 2 copies of Bristlebud Farmer. This is really a stronger mid-game option. It's a 5/5 trample body, but it also helps you find your pieces, and you can do so twice. This is a deck that wants to find its combo pieces. So Bristlebud Farmer, I can see where that would be a good choice. The rest of the deck, very similar to what we've seen in recent weeks.
So, Max, looking at this list, I'm mostly curious about Flood Pit's Drowner. How strong is that off the sideboard for this archetype, in your opinion?
I think this is great if you're trying to tempo the opponent's like really critical pieces. Like if you're saying Dimir tempo, Enduring Curiosity, Golgari mid range, trying to tempo them against their 4-drops. Dimir comes to mind immediately with Enduring Curiosity. Golgari also comes to mind with Archfiend or the Token Demon. So there's still quite a few good mid-range matchups where this really comes in strong. And notably, it's also a good option against something like Heartfire Hero in mono red, finding ways to sort of mitigate that damage. So I can see these sort of odds and ends, these pieces that Drowner is good against. It's good against a wide range of the meta. So that's probably why we're seeing an increase in this card getting play.
And Otters can grind. It just needs time, and I feel like you're right. Flood Pit's Drowner just buys you time. And sometimes, especially for a combo deck, that's all you need is a few turns. And considering you have Enduring Vitality, I love that it can provide mana on top of that. So, fair.
Absolutely.
Fair. Speaking of weird archetypes that are starting to emerge, though, yet again in Tier 2, this is the 3rd one in a row where we're just starting to see this trend of different things emerge. Azorius Cookies. Let's talk about it.
Oh yeah, Darius Zalman took down Saturday's 57-player 2-slot RCQ in Texas this past Saturday with Azorius Cookies, really absolutely demolishing Dimir in the process. And let's talk about why. I mean, it's easy to see why. This deck is aggressive. It's probably just one of the more straightforward aggressive decks that we have in the meta right now. Leyline Axe finally made the cut. We asked the question last week if this card was going to make the cut, and it did. Full set here. Notably, this also makes a good target for Zoetic Glyph, if nothing else. I mean, it's a good equipment by itself, but being a target for Zoetic Glyph helps. We've got the full Bunnicorn package, right? You got full Bunnicorns, full Mockingbirds. That leads you to 8 Bunnicorns, and that's amazing in a deck like this where you're pumping out artifacts turn 1. You've got, you're going wide with those creatures as well. Enduring Curiosity also works well here with all the evasion that you have turn 1. And then full set of one of the strongest cards right now in Standard, Sheltered by Ghosts. Great removal piece, great protection piece, really an all-around good card. Notably, 2 copies of Tish in the sideboard does work against the Overlords, I think, in addition to a plethora of targets that you also want to mitigate and diminish against, including the Enduring Innocence and Enduring Curiosity, which are still seeing play.
So, Max, of the 2 cookies lists, I picked this one because, one, I love Leyline Axe and Doomwake's list. This is the closest approximation to where we started, but I saw a different one where they took Leyline Axe, and again, this also won a tournament. They took out Leyline Axe, they replaced it with Dusk Rose Reliquary, and gave the deck a little bit more early removal, essentially. Do you think that's stronger than Leyline Axe, or do you think we want to be on the Axe right now?
I was thinking about that old article, "Who's the Beatdown?" and I think it's a meta-dependent answer, right? It really depends on whether you're the beatdown or not. I think Duskgrows deserve some slots, particularly in the sideboard. In most cases, I'm guessing this deck wants to be the beatdown, but there are instances versus other aggro where Duskgrows could really come in handy. I would place it in the sideboard. I don't know what you would cut. Maybe Elspeth's Smite. See if it's effective against the early curve aggro, especially. The Ward 2 helps in this regard. It also provides another base for Zoetic Glyph. So I like this card as a sideboard option. I don't know that I would replace the Leyline Axe. I'm still loving the Leyline Axe. It might be a bit of a pet card, but I still love the card. Possibly as a sideboard piece, I like Duskgrows.
Yeah, it's hard to walk away from Leyline Axe once you've popped it off before. You know what I mean? Especially when you have Enduring Curiosity that you can give things double strike and then draw 2 cards. Like that's some spice. I've gotten to do that once and it felt really good. But let's move along to the other blue-white deck, Azorius Oculus.
All right, Azorius Oculus. So Matt A smashed through a 41-player 2-slot RCQ in Oregon this past weekend with Azorius Oculus, really reminding everyone that the eye in the sky is never far from wiping out the competition. But let's see how the deck is currently positioned. I'm noticing a 2-2 split here between Unsummoned and Into the Flood Maw. The differences between these cards are very slight. We do have the single copy of Kiora doing work to dump into your graveyard. This version of the deck has a full set of Founding of the Third Path, which really helps to accelerate that graveyard strategy. And then I also want to point out just the 3 copies of Authority of the Consuls with the 2 copies of Split Up in the sideboard. These 2 cards go together really well. And notably, this choice also indicates the deck has gotten away from temporary lockdown in the main. It used to be able to run that. So, I'm wondering if that's just a meta-dependent choice, if the deck might go back to that in subsequent weeks. We do see the 3 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts in the sideboard as well. Really cool card. Obviously, not going to sing too much of its praises. We've talked about it already. And 1 copy of Sword of Once and Future in the sideboard. I want to ask the question, why not 2? It's doing a lot of work against one of the most popular decks right now, Dimir.
That's fair. That's very fair. The card is hot against Dimir. But, Max, I look at this and there's usually about 4 to 8 flex slots in Oculus, and the rest of it just has to stay in order to keep the combo running. Do we want Phantom Interference in the main, or do we want something like Drake Hatcher? Do we just want to hedge harder against aggro? What are you thinking?
I can see why Phantom Interference, right? The card does become irrelevant later in the game, but early in the game, it's going to provide a way to really mitigate against, the cards that you're obviously, alert for, which is Rest in Peace, Ghost Vacuum, those early game cards that they pull out on you, try to stop your strategy. Maybe we want this in the sideboard instead, honestly, for games 2, games 3. But I do see Exercise in the sideboard, so that does kind of help against Rest in Peace. I don't know. I like Phantom Interference more as a sideboard option. As for Drakecatcher, I love Drakecatcher. If we're not running temporary lockdown in the main, like I questioned, I think we do want this card. It provides a way to put pressure on the opponent. In light of all the decks in Standard that are snowballing late, like Otters, Dimir, Beans Piles, the way to respond to those decks a lot of times is to apply pressure early. This card does that, and it really keeps your foot on the gas. So I like Drakecatcher for that. I say let's main board that card if we're not going to run temporary lockdown.
Fair. And with that, we are through the tier list. We're on to my favorite portion of the show, Brewer's Corner. Now, let's go ahead and kick things off. Max, tell us what the hell Esper Flayer is.
Oh my gosh. So I'm going to try to run through this quickly because there's a lot to list here. The deck is using 3 copies of Throne of the Grim Captain. I've been beaten by this deck once on ladder. It surprised the hell out of me. I did not see this coming. Just to do the math here, you've got 3 Kioras, 2 Drowners equaling 5 Merfolk. You got 4 Zatalpas for your dinosaurs. You've got a full set of Malcolm for your pirates. You got 4 copies of Valinda for your vampires. And you've also got in the sideboard 2 more Drowners and another copy of a vampire with Drana and Linvala. So you've got a lot of legendaries. You've got a lot of variety of cards here. Throne of the Grim Captain is one of the cores of the deck, but doesn't necessarily need it to win. You're also using a full set of Urborg Scavenger here, which benefits greatly from putting stuff like Zatalpa, Alenda in your graveyard. So there's that as well. 3 copies of a card you don't see too often, Refute. This is a counter spell that lets you loot, that lets you put into your graveyard. And then the 3 copies of Kiora works really well here, letting you dump very quickly into your graveyard and take advantage of that. And some spice in the sideboard with the 2 copies of Kenrith's Royal Funeral, doing a variety of things, but notably making your legendaries cheaper and drawing you cards. So a lot of different pieces here that come together to form an interesting graveyard deck.
I mean, I love that by turn 3, you can theoretically get an Urborg Scavenger to exile as a Talpa and end up with a 3/3 flying double strike vigilance trample indestructible Urborg Scav. Like, what the hell? It's Anoint with Affliction or nothing at that point. Like, there's nothing else. It's wild. Yeah. I love that is actually a thing to do with this deck, because I had never thought this would actually be it. You know what I mean? Like, who looked at Throne of the Grim Captain and they're like, that'll make it? Nobody looked at that card and thought it was going to make it. Oh my god.
Another off the wall deck that maybe in subsequent weeks we'll be talking about this one, like, hey, it made it into tier 2. I'll be surprised, but still I see.
Fair. And with that, let's go to another weird deck and talk about Boros Discover. All right, credit to I Like Cookies, top 8 of a 74-player MTGO challenge with this wild archetype. So it's Discover. And it's like Imidane's Discover is the whole point of this. Like, you are discovering to 3 to get to Imidane's. That to me is the point of this deck. So you have all of these cards that technically cost, like 6, but they're actually 3 mana or 2 mana. And it goes that way. Like, it's just kind of wild how the deck looks so upper end of the curve, but it's actually pretty decent as far as the curve out goes. And you get to go into Imidane's and give everything haste so quickly. So I like where this is positioned. It's kind of a cool deck. I've actually played against this in the tournament, and I spent the first game just trying to figure out how the hell I was losing. I'm like, oh, we're fine. It's turn 4. We're fine. And then they went like Geological into Imidane's after a Virtue, and I'm like, oh, we're basically dead. Okay. That came out of nowhere. And we just had to completely shift gears going into the second game because I had no idea how this worked. It's a wild deck. I love what they're trying to do here, though. It's just fun to see these weird off-the-wall decks that may or may not work in subsequent weeks, but for like this week, that was the spice.
Yeah, and the deck can grind too. I mean, Quintorius Khan is a hell of a planeswalker. Adding bodies to the board, draining you for 2 every time you do the Discover mechanic, and just about every card in that deck has a Discover mechanic. So, the deck can grind if it doesn't get you with the Imidane's Recruiter for sure.
Right, and Quintorius Khan hasn't seen much play since it had the broken deck in one of the older formats. And we saw that for like week 1 of that format, and even Wizards was like, oh, absolutely not. We're not doing that. So we haven't really seen Khan in Standard like at all, basically, for the last year or so.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I was surprised to see it. But anyway, let's talk about the next list I have for y'all. This one's a Reanimator list. Love Reanimator. Mardu Reanimator. So credit to David Pound, who top 8 a 32-player 2-slot RCQ in Iowa. We've got, some of these things you've seen before, like in Riktus Reanimator. We've got the full set of Bitter Reunion, the full set of FOMO, which you know what that does. But this deck also runs a full set of Brotherhood's End. I think that's a necessary piece for all the aggro that we're still seeing. We've got 4 copies of Zombify, but also 4 copies of Rite of the Moth, which, with the recursive ability there, you can use it twice. And there are plenty of things to reanimate here. Kroxa and Knoros, 3 copies of those allow for even more reanimation later in the game. You're dumping with your early game plays, using Bitter Reunion, using FOMO, and you get the payoff for that even later, being able to exile 5 and reanimate something else. Also, one, I think, necessary copy of Riktus joins up. Got to take advantage of the fact that there are a lot of legendaries in here, including the full set of Atali, and that just makes the opponent pay. Riktus joins up seems like a necessary card for this version of Reanimator. And I also want to note the 4 copies of Atali. Atali hasn't been a popular reanimation target in a while, but I think in a meta where you're running a lot of the over-the-top, like domain lists, the Zur domain, you're running 4 to 6 drop creatures in some of these mid-range lists, Atali makes a little bit of sense here. So, I'm happy to see him come back as a Reanimator target.
Honestly, that list helped me with my own Reanimator list, because I'm sitting there like, what do I want a 3-drop? And I couldn't figure it out. And then I saw Trumpeting Carnosaur, and I'm like, oh, right. It's like kind of a 3-drop as a removal spell that is also an amazing reanimation target for value. I had completely forgotten that card existed until today, So I love where they went with that list. But let's kick off the last list here and talk about Selesnya Aggro. Credit to Ms. Lizzie, top 4 of a 91-player MTGO challenge on Saturday with this wild list, and I am here for it. It's got yet another big scorecard that I'm sitting here like, what was this? Like, I don't remember seeing this. I don't remember it seeing the light of day. But Blade Splicer Light in green is back. And with all of the creature tokens this generates, that secondary ability is actually quite relevant. You know, like you are playing Sanguine Evangelists and Bezas and Overlords and Virtues and things with Recruit. There's a lot you can do with this to just pump the army and keep rolling. And you note that it's kind of a swarm strategy because it's playing Restless Prairie. But what this build is doing that the prior ones didn't is it's also playing things like Sky Knight Squire and saying, yeah, we're going to take advantage of the swarm strategy by pumping up our version of Warden, and we're still going to have some decent removal early on to interact, but we're not going to focus on that too much because we can gum up the air against Dimir, we can gum up the board against red aggro, we've got life gain with Beza and Sheltered by Ghosts. It's got a lot of balance despite looking like just a pile of weird aggro cards.
Yeah, I like this iteration a little bit more than some of the initial ones I saw. I think this one's cleaned up a lot of its copies of different cards, and Sky Knight Squire is a pretty good inclusion as well. I think that's a pro move to include Sky Knight Squire and gum up the air as well. So very good deck.
And that brings us to our final. Yeah, and that brings us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, we've looked at 12 archetypes in our recap. What are you playing going into Week 5 of Foundation Standard?
All right, so I've been looking at the meta and, making decisions based on the meta. I think, honestly, the choice for this week for me is going to be Zur's Domain. So this version of the deck, we talked about how Domain in past weeks wasn't really ready for all the aggro. I think we've shored up some of those weaknesses. We've got 3 mainboard copies of Authority of the Consuls paired up with 2 copies of Split Up for the aggro. I just think this is a necessary tempo option for Domain to be able to hold its own until at least turn 4, turn 5, where it can really start moving and doing and adjusting things. I did include 1 single copy of Atraxa. I'm noticing a lot of mirror matchups, a lot of mid-range matchups. The Go Bigger decks are coming back. So the single copy of Atraxa really helps you to go over the top of those. So I think Atraxa is going to be a necessary inclusion, just a one of. We don't have to go back to the days of full sets of Atraxas. 3 Planeswalkers I've also included in the sideboard. Each I'm kind of toying with to see which one's the most effective, but these are all good game 2, game 3 options versus the other mid-range matchups. You've got Nissa, great against targeting the annexes, great against building your board state, pushing through. Liliana, great for cleaning up the board state, especially when you have quite a few of those Overlord tokens out there. And Kaya, hard to respond against. So I like Kaya still as a top-end option for this deck.
Fair. And that single red Overlord's a spicy one, Max. Fair enough.
Yep.
On my end, if you can't beat them, join them. Let's go back to Dimir. So this build is one I've been working on for a while. I think I'm 12-6 right now on the ladder with it. Just been tuning up different aspects of it. What I like is that this build is pre-hedged for red-based aggro. I will say it's got some weaknesses against Convoke. Very rough game 1 against Domain. And it's about even in most of the mirror matches. Again, very build dependent. If they're going to go on the full-on tempo Cryptomancer to Shauna's main, it gets worse. It's also slightly ahead against Demons so far in my testing. But I like the balance of this. This has a strong game plan for the primary game plan, which is let's try to just curve some removal into some nice 3 and 4 drops that are value engines that are incredibly difficult to shut down. And that's what it's trying to do. It's winning on card advantage and having cheap, efficient answers to what's being played against you. That's why you have 10 pieces of removal. That's why you have the 4 Flood Pits. You have Fairy to stay in the game, and it only has 2 counters in the main and only an additional 3 in the sideboard because we're not really trying to play a counter war with even the Domain builds. They have caverns. We're not, you can't go into it like that. You're trying to tempo them, and this very much pushes the tempo aspect.
Yeah, that's a very good strategic note. We still have Cavern in the meta. So very good point about the counter spells. Some of those slots are probably better spent elsewhere. And I noticed you put the Preachers in the main, so that answers our earlier question about what you would prefer, I think.
You lose to Heartfire Hero 1 too many times, and you just start jamming copies of Preacher in the main like, never again.
For sure, for sure. Well, that about does it. That's another week in the books. Thank you for supporting us, and really a special shout out to all our members who watch these videos all the way through, week to week. Thank you so much for the support, and we'll be back one more week in December next week for more analysis.
And a quick note that after we prepped this show, but before we recorded, I grabbed one more tournament result, and Jeskai Convoke made up 4 slots in that top 8. So, make sure you've got some sweepers ready this weekend, because clearly Convoke's having a coming out party. And, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment on this video. Every click helps, guys. It's true. I know I say it every week, but it does help us tremendously. And until next time, Rebels, untap, upkeep, resist.